Okay, I think it's working now. Sorry for the delay. Just a little bit of technical difficulties there before, but hopefully it's working now. All right, well, welcome to Book Breaks, Fulton County's live streaming story time for adults. I'm Shauna Schaefer. I'm a library associate at the Cleveland Avenue branch, and today I'm going to read to you from this book. It is a feminist speculative fiction anthology called Sisters of the Revolution, edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. And the story that I have chosen for you is by Anne Richter, translated by Edward Govan. It's called The Sleep of Plants. Anne Richter is a Belgian author, editor, and scholar. Her first collection, written at the age of 15, was translated as The Blue Dog by Alice B. Toklas, who praised her in the preface. In addition to her own fiction, she's known for editing an international anthology of female fantastical writers and writing essays about women writers in fantastical literature. In The Sleep of Plants, a woman transforms into a plant in order to escape a humdrum, predictable life and seek the solitude she desires. It was first published in her collection Les Locataires, The Tenants, in 1967. And she begins her story with a quote from Henri Michaud. Quote, "Slowing, we feel the pulse of things." End quote. She lived like a plant. The rhythms of her life were more vegetable than human. She was prone periodically to sliding slowly into sleep. She remained inactive, immobile, hands crossed on knees, head tilted slightly toward one shoulder, staring straight ahead. Sometimes it was a tiny thing, a wearied bee gone astray in a fold of curtain, patiently, haltingly making the climb, stopping to gather its strength. The bee would hunch up briefly before setting out again. The young woman waited for the moment when the insect would fall, at once wishing for and fearing it, so much a part of the creature's misery that her palms were moist. Or she would observe the exact whirl of dust motes in the light, between dresser and rug, finding secret calm in their constant movement. She followed water droplets gliding down gray panes, or would slip into one of her lengthy afflictions, which never threatened her life, which she seemed to prolong for pleasure, from which she returned unhurriedly, eyes widened, a blue tinge to her skin, as if dazzled by the light upon leaving the cave. She sank into utter solitude, surrounding herself with a rampart of silence. In these moments her thoughts were vague, yet followed a precise path. With a spider's patience, she forced herself from behind half-closed eyelids to catch, unawares, things as she felt they must be. This required total stillness, arduous efforts of concentration. Meticulously, she repeated everyday words until they lost their usual meaning. Spoon, spoon, she would say, softly and stubbornly. She would polish the word, handling it almost absent-mindedly, yet taking care to treat it as respectfully as she could, never to consider it and see only usefulness. Little by little, it lost all consistency. Then began the meticulous work of a watchmaker. She persisted cautiously, decanted it, slowly breathed new life into the word. Sometimes she saw it come round, get back on its feet. Then she would discover an entirely new meaning. She called this undressing words. One day she got engaged. Her fiancé was a likable young man. Sundays they often went for walks in the countryside. They trod carefully, hand in hand, along meadows and hedges. They spoke of this and that, without passion or impatience. One morning George wanted to show her a place he'd found. They'd packed a lunch and set out. It was unusually warm. All the trees were in bloom, and the grass was tall in the fields. "There it is!" cried George. "Let's run for it." They both broke into a sprint, and the young woman flew through the grass, laughing and waving her arms, displaying an unusual vitality. She reached the first trunk and threw her arms around it. Her fiancé caught up and kissed her on the mouth. The woods before them were split between sunlight and shadow. But suddenly she felt faint, and her hands gripped the bark. The young man was worried, surprised. "Oh, it's nothing," she said. She sat down in the grass and leaned her head against the trunk. Then she went pale, smoothed her dress, and glanced anxiously at her fiancé. "What a pretty place," she said. But le déjeuner sur l'herbe was ruined. They stopped going for walks. Her fiancé tried to drag her along, but she stubbornly refused, pleading fatigue. Around this time, she did in fact suffer from inexplicable spells of weariness. She was sorry, in all her immobility, that she couldn't sink roots, bore into the ground for good, surround herself with a quiet cloud of light, like those around pines or over certain shrubs in summer. But she had to get up from her chair, go here, go there. She did violence to herself, speaking, moving, and afterwards fell back trembling, mouth dry, dying of thirst, like a plant denied water. The activity around her seemed less comprehensible than ever. Needless commotion, futile chaos. And yet the regular course of daily affairs troubled her. She furled her leaves, lived on nothing. She was like a cactus, skin tender behind protecting needles, needing little water and light to live. She saw that by dint of stillness and withdrawal, you felt yourself become the center of the world, the source of its movement. As a child, she played at becoming the center of the world, an extraordinary game she never tired of, secretly aware, perhaps, of its gravity and power. She would walk backward, head thrown back and gazing at the sky until she grew dizzy. That was what she wanted, for dizziness to make her see things differently, herself frozen and the earth yawing, the sun and the clouds whirling about, or else, sitting in a moving train, feeling the coarseness of the seat cushion beneath her palms, aware of the cadenced pace of travel in every part of her body. The train car stinking of cold ash, wet clothes, and smoke, she would scrutinize the white square of window, and suddenly the world would begin to change. The train had stopped. In the corner of her window, she'd watch all the people walking, the meadows leaping past, the fleeing sky, slashed in its flight by taut telephone wires. This state of grace almost always ended soon. The world grew still again, and her train car clattered along God knew where. Bitterness flooded her, disgust. She believed herself the only living person in a dead world shaken by sound and fury till the day she understood. In motionlessness, movement found its source. She decided to fall silent, and in silence, animate the world. This is what she did. She found a giant stoneware pot, a great bag of humus. She stepped into the basin, covered her legs in a blanket of earth. She vanished up to her hips. How good it felt. Never had she known such ecstasy. She was back in her element. From the depths of herself rose a silence. Still, a certain nervousness persisted, a tingle at the end of her fingers, toes, like expectation. I'll get used to it, she thought, wiggling her toes. But there was a knock at the door. What would she tell her mother? The door opened and their eyes met. What grief in her mother's gaze. I always expected the worst from you, but not this, not this. Look, I've always given in, but this time your tears are wasted. In fact, things stayed much the same. After the initial shock, the usual routine set in. She'd never taken up much space in family life. From now on, she took up none at all. An empty chair at dinner was pushed to a corner. A vacant bed was moved to the attic. Clothes were given to the poor. Not once did her mother lift her gaze to the heavy basin upstairs. She vacuumed around it, cleaned the rug without comment, dusted quickly, her face expressionless. Maybe she hoped, by denying her daughter light, to see her wither and die. But plants are hardy. They have all the time in the world and a gift for frugality. When her fiancé came to see her, he didn't know what to say. He raised the blinds. She looked pale, her eyes ringed. Her arms hung slack at her sides like dead branches, her neck bowed beneath the moss of her hair. She gazed at him, not without a certain annoyance in her eyes. Had his movements always been so brusque? She couldn't recall suffering from them before. "You always said you wanted me to be happy," she murmured. "Probably you never noticed I was unhappy? This had to happen sooner or later. Isn't it better that it happened before we got married? You're still free now. Don't worry about hurting me." George tried to take her hand, but it was so cold, as if blood were ever so slowly receding from it. "How can you talk like that? Don't you know I love you? I would have died for you. But I can see that doesn't mean a thing to you. You're deliberately destroying yourself. What can I give you now?" Despite everything, she was touched. But she was tired. The darkness had been a terrible ordeal for her. She turned her faded eyes to the sun, made an effort to speak. "You're generous, George. There's something you can do for me if you want. My mother won't admit it, but I know she wants to bring things to an end as soon as she can. But I need food. Bring me things to eat and drink." She was still a bit of a carnivore. Her fiancé brought her flies, mosquitoes, sometimes spiders. She swallowed them whole, hurriedly, craning her neck forward, snapping at them with sudden movements of her jaw. It was a peculiar sight, which her fiancé had a hard time watching. He turned discreetly away. But she soon lost her taste for meat. All that remained was a yearning for pure water, a dream of springs. Her ideas took the shape of leaves. Vague desires for silence. She spoke less and less. A bit embarrassed by her muteness, the fiancé spoke for them both. One day he said, "If you'd wanted, Anya," but he didn't finish his sentence. He saw quite well that she no longer wanted a thing. In fact, she no longer even needed his presence. She possessed it forever behind closed eyes. But he was still talking. They were all still talking. How badly she wanted to drive off this insufferable swarm of words, as if waving away harmful insects. Downstairs they were saying, "Where's Anya?" "Oh, in her room, at a boarding house, traveling. She's so shy, painfully shy." She was waiting for her roots. She shouldered the suffering of plants. The thirst of cut flowers torquing their stalks toward the light, the moist dream of seaweed abandoned on the sand, the cold of rose bushes in November frost, the passing madness of indoor plants devouring walls and windows, the furious proliferation of exotic blossoms brought over like slaves, strewing the four corners of the yard with the sinister fruit of their revolt, the sighs of men stuck in the mud of futile acts. Her fiancé conscientiously brought her water every day before going to work. He grew discouraged about talking, but she didn't notice. Sometimes he looked worried, but she was too preoccupied to notice. She was waiting. How long it was, the sitting still and waiting. We fill our days with distractions, but perhaps it would be better to be faithful to waiting. To wait, without moving, speaking, lifting a finger, in a room as bare as this one. Her roots grew overnight. She felt them everywhere, piercing the earth. What joy, alas, and what pain. She felt like she was traveling backward up the river of time. Odors assailed her, shifting essences. Her adolescence had an anxious scent, like bitter linden. Some had grown in the school playground where she'd always felt so bored. Her childhood smelled like sorb trees. She saw herself going down a curving path. A blackbird cackled from deep in a bush. Sorb apples lay bleeding in the grass. She squashed them underfoot. What world would spring forth when she rounded the bend? She advanced cautiously. With one final push, her roots punctured soil. Now she descended, heart pounding, toward an odor. The odor of the day she was born. Her birth had a dull smell, like the smell hanging over iron quarries. Her birth smelled like ferns. She saw a glittering fern, its crozier erect, scratch at the sky with its palm of light. The next morning, her leaf hands were open. Her fiancé came to see her, looking vexed. He sat down beside her, head lowered. Look, I've given this a lot of thought. I think I owe it to you to tell you this. I've met someone. A young woman, the sister of someone at work. She's sweet, serious-minded. She looks like you a bit. You're the one who told me life goes on. But I can't just abandon you. Our lives are intertwined. Anya, do you want to come to our wedding? Come live with us? A light breeze came in through the window. It caressed the trunk, played in the branches. The leaves up top bent forward a bit in silent approbation. George bent over, lifted up the heavy stoneware basin. For a moment, the leaves grew flustered, shuddered, but they soon recovered their dreamy stillness. As Anya crossed the doorsill in the young man's arms, the mother, deep in her kitchen, closed her fist around a saucepan and turned her back to the couple. George planted her in his yard, in the middle of the lawn. The roots breathed freely. She thanked him with a happy nod of foliage. One sunny morning not long after, he got married. The little pale-cheeked bride floated among the guests, light as a water lily. There was dancing beneath leaves bathed in moonlight. That summer, the tree put forth splendid blossoms. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you so much for joining us for a book break today, and be sure to tune in next week for the next installment. I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Take care. Be safe. We love you.